So I might push it out to late 2025 to give myself more room, but I do think there's a good chance of seeing six figures in this next, call it 3-year cycle. That's not for sure. I wouldn't go levered long and assume that to be the case. I wouldn't build a business specifically that's going to happen, but if I would say my base case is I would expect to see six figures over, say, the next 3 years.
Six figures is in 100,000 or even potentially higher than 100,000?
I think we start with 100,000 or 120,000 and see if we get to that before making higher conviction, higher price targets from there.
By 2025.
Yes.
Bitcoin held its most recent gains into May 27th as traders called for a change in bearish market sentiment. The week's macroeconomic data from the United States had ended with a surprise, as a new personal consumption expenditures (PCE) index print showed the economy weathering tighter financial conditions much better than expected. Markets then began to price in a June interest rate hike from the Federal Reserve, which should form a headwind for risk assets but failed to dampen a BTC price rebound. Despite the price comeback, however, the mood remained overly cautious for some. Retail is so extremely bearish on Bitcoin and crypto, it's almost insane, Michael van de Poppe, founder and CEO of trading firm 8, argued. People are stuck in the 2022 mindset. Hello and welcome to Money Talks. In today's video, Lyn Alden shared with us her prediction for Bitcoin and the Fed's next move, and how it will impact the economy and the crypto industry.
The banking system's unstable, and people say, well, I can self-custody money with Bitcoin. I don't have to worry about counterparty risk. I think that's part of it, but I think probably the bigger move is basically due to markets repricing their forward expectations for how aggressively the Fed can hike rates. So we saw, for example, that 2-year treasuries, stopped increasing. We saw that, as you pointed out, the market's pricing in cuts by the end of the year. And a lot of that changed pretty rapidly, beginning with the banking crisis. And when you had a softening of forward expectations for how hawkish the Fed can be, then it gives a bid towards kind of anti-dollar trades, scarce assets like gold and Bitcoin. And so I think the biggest move that we've seen probably in this thing is not necessarily the narrative itself, but the kind of the structural market implications of rates. So I think as the Fed shifts from, tighten money as tight as possible, control inflation as much as possible, and instead kind of balance that between financial stability, that's what's given Bitcoin and other scarce assets a chance to catch a bid. I think the challenge is that when we go back to those liquidity questions I talked about earlier, like if the Treasury tries to refill its a cash account really quickly while the Fed's still doing QT, it's probably not going to be good for Bitcoin for, say, a multi-week period, most likely. But when you do get some sort of pivot, either the Fed ends its QT program or has to launch some sort of new liquidity program, or the Treasury has to take some other action, I would be a buyer of that capitulation if you were to get one. So I think most likely, you can never know for sure. I think the prior cycle was destructive on this because, for example, Bitcoin formed a very big bottom in late 2018, early 2019, and then it grinded significantly higher. But then it kind of retested that bottom very briefly during the March 2020 sell-off. And so it didn't hit like lower lows, but it did kind of briefly go back and plumb those depths. And the difference was that it didn't stay there for many months. It just kind of had this like big flick down, and you had the liquidity response, and a number of weeks later, it was already back up to well above that bottom. And I think you could see a similar thing where you get kind of a brief problem that brings it down maybe lower than we expect. But I don't think it would stay in that lower band anywhere near as long as it did in this.
What is the price range on that lower band that you consider to be the bottom?
I think I wouldn't be surprised to see it touch the lower 20s again if we get that specific scenario of a liquidity crisis from trying to refill the Treasury general account. There are scenarios that I think could push it to the upper teens yet again. But I think that would be it probably spend less time there than it did in this prior bottom. And instead, if they actually front run this, if the Fed ends quantitative tightening before you get the Treasury pull up, or if the Treasury does proactively kind of focus on issuing T-bills or increasing their Treasury account slower, then I think you're much less likely to retest those lows.
Popular trader Skew noted Bitcoin's strong reaction at the 200-week moving average, MA, near $26,000, with more key trendline challenges now in the making. Price trying to reclaim 100 DMA after nice move up from 200 WMA. Price is currently pinned between 4 HEMAs and 1 DEMAs, analysis of the 4-hour BTC USD chart stated the day prior. Expecting a pretty major move soon, inflection point is here IMO. Fellow trader and analyst Rect Capital stated that additional strength was still needed to flip the trajectory in the bull's favor. BTC still in the middle of the red downtrending channel, just consolidating here with the red resistance area above the crucial one to beat if sentiment is to decisively shift in the short term, he wrote, referring to a chart of one-day timeframes. That chart also showed the bearish head and shoulders pattern, something Rect Capital previously warned could result in a longer-term bearish phase, including a trip toward $20,000.
Yeah, I think the next 2 years or 3 years look very constructive. I think basically we have this window where the next 6 months, there's a lot of variables that I think could throw us off. I think Stanley Druckenmiller said it best. He's like, I can make the case for deflation or I can make the case for 8% inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's touching on the same kind of uncertainties I'm touching on here, which is that there's very key decision points that a handful of individuals can make, and that can determine pretty big swings in what happens. So I think that basically next 6 months for Bitcoin, very unclear. I can make the case for retesting the lows, or I can make the case for, not going below 25,000. But that I think that the 2-year or the 3-year case is very, very strong. I have high conviction that basically we'll probably have another positive liquidity cycle in that environment. And right now the valuation is very attractive, compared to its longer term, say, moving averages. I also think if you look at Bitcoin holding behavior, generally one thing you see in bull markets is that long-term holders begin selling some of their Bitcoin because they're up 5x, 10x, all this new money's rushing in, and they're reducing their positions. When you have bear markets, you generally instead see long-term holders are not selling, that they're buying more, and you start to get a very large percentage of Bitcoin that haven't moved in a year or more. And right now, we're very tight in that metric. Basically, we have a lot of indicators kind of either pointing that the bottom's in or that the bottom at most is likely to be retested. And so I'm very constructive with, say, a 2 to 3 year view. I think the biggest signal is that the Fed has to begin changing its hawkishness, despite the fact that they haven't met their inflation targets. So, for example, if you go back to 2019 during the repo rate spike, in September of 2019, the repo market had all sorts of problems, and the Fed had to abruptly end their quantitative tightening and shift to a form of quantitative easing, and they had trouble explaining why they had to do it. And it was in large part because you had T-bills crowding out bank reserves. And if you see a similar environment where they have to kind of pivot prematurely, and yet that happens in an above target inflation environment, I think that would be a sign that they've kind of lost control of inflation, and that that would be a very strong signal to want to buy other assets, either hard assets or generally anything that would benefit from a weaker dollar at that point.
So, is it a good time to invest in Bitcoin? And what's your prediction for Bitcoin in 2023? Tell us in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you soon with the next video. Thank you so much for watching.